Gil Rogers, and this is the next in the series of our programs about the Medfield State Hospital and the master planning process that we're going through. And today we have a very interesting discussion on smart growth and housing. And with me today is Andre LaRue, who's the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. And welcome for being on this program. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gil.
It's a pleasure to have Andre here and to talk to us about some of the issues at Medfield State Hospital and the planning process, some of the interesting trends that we see in demographics in the area, and then to come away at the end with some suggestions about our planning process. So Andre, to start, maybe you could just give us a little bit of background about what the Smart Growth program is.
Sure. Well, thanks first of all for having me here today, Gil. It was great. I got to speak to the advisory committee of the town for the state hospital redevelopment project
Right.
a couple of months ago, and so it's great to be back and talk a little bit about these concepts so the rest of the town can hear about them too. Mm-hmm. When we talk about smart growth, we're really talking about a quality of life, and we're talking about creating diverse opportunities for people in their communities around housing, around transportation, ways of getting around, in terms of jobs and education and retail opportunities. So it's really, the notion, it goes back to what we used to think of as a village, the traditional New England village or community. In order to have a successful community, you need to have people from all generations, young people, families, older folks, and you also you need to have things for them to do in terms of working, in terms of places for them to live, and opportunities to get ahead in life. So and recreational opportunities, no doubt too.
Yeah, and you mentioned the different segments, the different aspects of our community. And I think one of the things that would be helpful is to just describe or define what we mean by baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, millennials, senior citizens, just to give everybody kind of a common set of terms or definitions for what we mean by these segments.
Yeah, it's very interesting what's happening in the United States and obviously in Massachusetts in terms of our demographic shifts and the way that our real estate market is shifting in response to those changes in population. So the baby boomers, historically the largest generation of our society, they are getting older and they are looking for new kinds of places to live. So we're talking generally, they're entering retirement age, they're 55 plus, it's a new phase of their lives, their kids have generally moved out, and many of them are looking to downsize. And so they've been in large single-family homes for the most part as a generation, and now they want to stay active longer than ever before, and they want to be close to opportunities to walk around and do activities, be close to their friends, be close to their family, their children, but they don't want to take care of large lawns, right? And they want to have a more modest living spaces, and we don't have enough housing for them right now. Then there's the Generation X, which is my generation, and this is, I have two kids, 14 and 11, and this is really the kind of the school age family demographic. And it's actually a smaller demographic than it has been in the past because it's smaller than the baby boomer generation and also smaller than the generation that comes after it, which is Generation Y, or what's commonly referred to as the millennials. And the millennials are those young professionals. They're just starting to generate their own households, right? So they're moving out of their families' homes, and oftentimes they're living on their own, or as couples, or with roommates, and overwhelmingly they're looking for different kinds of things than past generations have. Rather than finding a job and then living near that job, they're actually looking at communities first. and looking at the quality of life of those communities. And so they're finding some place to live where they want to live, and then they're looking for jobs. They're also increasingly they're living independently longer, right? Living on their own longer, and they also, as a result, they want smaller living spaces, right, where they can have sort of single household living quarters.
Millennials, because these are people who were born before 2000, is that why we call them millennials?
Yes, exactly. They're at that age right now where they're graduating from high school, or they're into college, or they're in their 20s. And they're just starting that household formation. And one thing that's really important to understand about this shift is that they're actually a larger generation even than the baby boomers. And they are, as a result, when you look at the baby boomer generation being so large, and they're looking to downsize and move into new housing types, you look at the millennial generation being so large and they're looking for new housing types. As a country, 90% of the new households that are being formed are single-person households. And historically, those are not the kinds of homes that we have been developing. Even if Massachusetts were to keep the same population that it's had, we would still need in the area of tens of thousands of more housing units, but smaller housing units, apartments.
Now, there's another segment too, right? I would put myself more into the senior resident or senior citizen community, which is important here in Medfield.
Yeah, absolutely. And that segment of the community requires different services, I think continual care in some cases. But at the same time, seniors don't want to be isolated from the community. Increasingly, people are staying active longer. I know you're very active too, and an outdoorsman yourself. And so we see that we need to figure out how to do better at making multi-generational communities.
So at Medfield State Hospital, I mean, would one of the ideas be to actually try to provide, a diversity of housing that can meet all of these different segments, but integrated together in some way?
Yeah, the way that I like to think about it is that, the state hospital had a past that was sort of from a different era. It was really a different era when folks who had mental illness were meant to be isolated and not to be seen. And that's why it was
cities, crowded, compact industrial cities like Boston at the time. And people wanted to get out of that, people that wanted to get out into the rural, more natural environment, out of the cities.
Right, well, and that's why, Medfield has attracted the population that it's had, but the state hospital was really set apart. And what needs to happen is to kind of reintegrate that complex of buildings back into the community and reconnect it back to the existing neighborhoods that Medfield has. And so, we can look to our own history in New England and look at the New England Village for some inspiration, where you have a small village, but it's walkable, it's compact, and it has a range of housing and different kinds of amenities for all people of all ages.
And I think for myself too, I love the idea of living with a diverse population, of young families, of individual professionals, other senior people that like to get out and do stuff, with the environment or the river, that type of thing. So I love the idea of integrating this together in some sort of a, pleasant campus setting.
Yeah, and families are changing too, and increasingly grandparents are participating more in raising their grandchildren. Right. And I think that we need to create opportunities for different kinds of families, multi-generational families, to be together.
Excellent. Now, I noticed one of the things, I was looking at some of the demographic statistics for this area.
Yeah.
I was looking at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council statistics, and one of the things that really comes out of that when you look at the Medfield population is that you have out-migration, and particularly very noticeable in two segments. One is the sort of the younger people in college or getting out of college and starting their careers, that segment. And the other is in the baby boomers and the older people, and the senior citizens. And there seems to be, from the statistics that I've seen, a real trend for those people leaving the area What do you think is going on there in those two groups?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you look at the statistics for Medfield over the last couple of decades, you see it's people my age, Generation Xers with children that have been moving in, because that's really the housing stock that's here in Medfield, is sort of larger homes that can accommodate children. And however, you're losing both seniors and really in particular your younger people who are going to college, or they're moving into jobs, or they're starting their own families, and they can't stay anymore. And that's it's related to a couple of things. First of all, it's related to their preferences. As I mentioned before, millennials, I think something like 80% of millennials would prefer to live in a walkable urban environment. And then when I say urban environment, I don't necessarily mean they want to move to the big city, but they want to be in places where they can live and work, they can go to a cafe, they can be near friends and other people their age. There are things to do. They want that exciting environment. And so, most suburban communities, including Medfield, don't have a lot of places to offer that population. And one of the big challenges that I think suburban communities have nowadays is to figure out how to create those little nodes. I mean, you've got a great town center, Medfield Town Center. You've started to do that. You have the library, you have the plaza, you have a little park, you have a supermarket, you have town hall, you have some shops. You got a great cluster there. And that's you need to build on that, and you need to create maybe one or two other places in town, and the state hospital complex I think represents a great chance to do that.
One of the things that you've mentioned, I know, in some of the things you've written, and when you came and met with our committee for the planning, was a group called Pioneers.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the Wild West or something, But what do you mean by pioneer? Are there pioneers around now?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in real estate terms, a pioneer group is one that goes into an unestablished market or a weak market and really makes that market work. So, for example, you might see it in some of the old mill towns or mill cities that we have in New England that have beautiful building stock, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square feet. A lot of it's just being used for warehousing. And so the ways that they've been able to come back has been to make it attractive for pioneers like artists, outdoorsy people, artisans, craftspeople, to come in and really use that space. So a lot of live workspace, for example, is emblematic
like artist
of these
studios, for example,
Absolutely.
Where people live in have a condominium or an apartment, but then they work in maybe another space there, but do artistic work or music or something like that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the great thing about the state hospital complex, for example, is that because it is a little isolated, it's surrounded by hundreds of acres of conservation land and trails, and it's right near the Charles River. There's a new park being developed there with the kayak and canoe landing. I think that's going to attract another kind of pioneer, one that's really geared towards the outdoor lifestyle. And so if you kind of think of the artisan pioneers, and you think of the arts people, and you think of those outdoor recreation pioneers, those are potential markets for you those are the kinds of people that would be willing to come into some place that's not yet established and begin to create a funky community.
Another thing that we talk a lot about, and our planning committee has been addressing a lot, is affordability. Affordability, and we've often thought that there's really two types of affordability. There's what we call affordability from the state law perspective, from the 40B perspective, but then there's also just the ability for people to get into this expensive market here, to buy a house or buy a condominium in this area where the average prices are very high. And I wonder if you could comment just on what you think of as affordability.
Well, that's right. I think that when I think of the larger forces in the market, you look at Metro Boston, we're one of the most expensive housing markets in the whole country. And that's not going to get better anytime soon because we're just not building enough housing to meet the demand, particularly because of these demographic changes that I was mentioning. We've done a pretty good job as a region of building large homes on large lots, and Medfield has a lot of those kinds of homes and the surrounding communities as well. But where we've done poorly is that we've underbuilt, underproduced apartments. We've underproduced small single-family homes that are accessible to new families starting out, which you call starter homes, that are at a price point that people earlier in their careers can afford. And as a result, we're seeing a really dysfunctional housing market. So places that have good transportation access, that have exciting, vibrant communities around them, places like Cambridge, parts of Boston, Somerville, places like that are doing extraordinarily well. They're off the charts. And other places are maybe not doing quite as well. They're losing parts of their community that they would like to keep. Or, the prices are going through the roof. So to the extent that we can create more community assets and mix that with some smaller unit types so that older people that want to downsize can stay in the community, so that people's children who grew up in the community and want to stay can also afford to stay somewhere. Those are the kinds of units we really need.
Now, do you see, we have, I don't know, something like 34 buildings up at the hospital. These were, big brick structures that architecturally are very attractive in various states of, structural soundness. And so probably all the buildings can't be preserved. But could some of these, you think, be preserved and meet some of the needs of these segments?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple things to keep in mind, though. It has to be viable for development, right? For investment to come in and be able to make a profit. That's what's going to cause investment to happen. So what's going to be there is going to be a blend of the old and the new. It's going to be we're not going to be able to keep all of those buildings, and I think people have to reconcile themselves to that fact. A lot of these buildings were built for another era, and they're not well designed for the kinds of things that I was just talking about. So maybe some of those buildings will be renovated, and there'll be additions, modern additions attached to them. Some of them may have to be demolished. Some of them may be able to be preserved in their current state, and that's going to be I think, an important part of the planning process to figure that out.
Or even some of them being combined together, linked together. These are separate buildings, but to make it viable, it may be possible to tie several of the buildings together to make a viable living. One of the things I wanted to ask you about too is this concept of density, housing density. Everybody talks about housing density. And maybe you could just, first of all, give us kind of a definition of what we mean by housing density. What's high density, what's low density?
Right. Well, I actually don't like to use the word density too much. I like to use the word walkable, because it's really hard to picture different kinds of density. You could have something that's low density be very ugly and unattractive. You could have something that's high density be very attractive. And in fact, many of these places where I said the real estate values are shooting through the roof are actually very high density places. But they're enjoyable to walk in. They have a good quality of life, and I think that should really be the focus. So, for example, you have a great local example here, Old Village Square, where a local developer was able to create sort of a little mini village, what I like to term a pocket neighborhood. And so on what would ordinarily be just sort of 8 single-family home lots, there's actually 42 homes. So that's a great example of high density, but it's a density that adds value to the town, and it adds value to the neighborhood, and it has very high market demand, and they're filling right up. So if we could do more of that kind of density, that would be important.
And I see, there's a very important, I guess you'd call it, value in Medfield that I think are shared by much of the population for preserving open space. It's a very important, I think, fundamental value, why people moved out here, And, do you see that there's a connection, a relationship between, these more compact neighborhoods or pocket neighborhoods and the idea of preserving open space?
You've hit on something very important. People react poorly to the idea of density because they think that it's going to mean a loss of what makes their town, their community special. They associate that with a loss of open space and special character. And what density can actually do is help preserve the character of that town. And again, if we look back to the historic town centers and villages of New England, those are compact forms, and they were surrounded by farms, they were surrounded by woodlands, and we can do the same thing here. You know, you definitely need, if you're going to have more people, you need to have better recreational facilities and more trails, and I think we can make better use of the land. Access to the Charles River, for example.
The other thing that's really important in town too is Medfield has a lot of very strong cultural dimensions to it, and artists, performing theaters, music. The school system has a very strong music program. So you have a lot of this potential and examples of cultural activity. And I think similarly you have a trade-off, you know, of where you can use development and maybe even what we would call the more compact development to support or to really be a driver in a way of why you're creating value in the hospital by bringing in this cultural aspect to it.
Yes. Well, you know, I think there's an interesting example northwest of Boston in Lincoln, the Cordova Museum and Sculpture Garden. It's obviously a different kind of a facility. It was started as a museum, but it's a similar kind of a community in that it's a fairly affluent community. There's a lot of conservation land, a fantastic regional trail network, and the way that that cultural center fits in there, it's become a regional destination. I used to take my kids there to the Sculpture Garden when they were little for picnics, and you know, I love the idea of doing something in partnership with an institution like that because they understand how to make something like that work. Having artists in residence, for example, in using some of these buildings, perhaps on a temporary basis, right? So that maybe for 3 to 5 years, while the whole process is happening, there are some artists that are allowed to maintain the space and use the space and start to build a sense of community there. So it's not just a set of, you know, closed or derelict buildings that are there.
Well, it's been very helpful, giving us a lot of good ideas. And just in concluding it, if you had to make some suggestions or recommendations on the Medfield State Hospital in our planning process, it's very active now. What would you give us as advice?
Well, I've touched on, I think, a few of them. I think one would be to explore partnerships with existing institutions, whether they're an art and culture institution or higher education or maybe a medical facility, having a satellite facility that would bring some jobs and needed services to the town would be very important. I think making the connections between that site, which right now is pretty isolated in town, to other parts of the town. That means connecting it through a regional network of trails and recreational program. So there's some recreational planning that needs to be done, but it also means, I think, finding ways of building maybe some new pocket neighborhoods around the edges that will help blend that site more into the existing neighborhoods and recreational areas. Those are I think, two of the most important things. And then, well, having a multi-generational community and having a diverse range of activities and amenities on the site, I think, would be helpful. And in order to do that, I think you really have to build the site organically. It's going to be difficult to just come in and with one fell swoop and redevelop the whole complex because it's a complicated site, and I think you want to do it lovingly and have it really be part of the community. There is one point that I didn't touch on that I do think is important to make around the smart growth, is that there is a real benefit for the town financially in terms of smart growth development. If you're able to do walkable development, studies have shown that it really brings back net in terms of tax value to the community, even with a lot of residential units, 4 to 6 times what sort of typical subdivision development would do, which is what a lot of what happens in surrounding towns. So, there's less infrastructure involved and in provision of services, and you really have more of a community that attracts people and investment.
Well, thanks so much. This has been very insightful and creative and yet pragmatic, and I think that's what we're looking for. And I just want to mention too that you have a website on smart growth where a lot of the research and pictures and photographs and ideas are up there, and that's www.ma-smartgrowth.org.
Yes.
And then the other website that I'd like to just mention too is the one that we have for the hospital, which is www.ma-smartgrowth.org. mshvision.net. And we're putting a lot of material up on that all the time, including this series of videos. So again, I'd like to thank you, Andre, for a very helpful discussion. And I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this program, and also express our appreciation to Medfield.tv for putting this series of programs together.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've got a great opportunity here, and I hope that you make the most of it.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.